And that's a fact.
Honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the deadline for the Canada Summer Jobs Program passed last month, but I am still hearing from groups and organizations from my riding and across Canada that are confused and unsure whether or not they will be approved for funding like they have in previous years. These groups aren't the monsters the Liberals are making them out to be. They're summer camps, food banks, groups working with at-risk youth and those challenged physically or emotionally, seniors' homes, personal care facilities, and groups working with new refugees, helping them to adjust to life in a new country, finding accommodation and helping them with English as a second language, and finding social networks to help new arrivals develop friendships and connections. To have this Liberal government attack them day in and day out in the media and here in this House is shameful and has left them feeling like enemies of their government. Conservatives believe in Canadians' fundamental freedoms, the right to freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, and the right to freedom of expression. No one has the right to prevent others from advocating or expressing their beliefs, especially their government. That's why Conservatives oppose the values test this Liberal government has imposed on applicants for Canada Summer Jobs Grants. Under this test, if you don't sign the attestation agreeing with the ideological positions of the Liberal Party, your organization will no longer be eligible to receive funding for a summer student. Mr. Speaker, let me read the attestation. Both the job and the organization's core mandate must respect individual human rights in Canada, including the values underlying the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as other rights. These include reproductive rights and the right to be free from discrimination on the basis of sex, religion, race, national or ethnic origin, color, mental or physical disability, or sexual orientation, or gender identity or expression. Like I already said, Mr. Speaker, this is directly affecting groups in my riding and across Canada to the point that now many organizations have made the tough decision and have refused to apply for Canada Summer Jobs programs this year. Mr. Speaker, I think about the loss of these important services. It's a huge loss to our community, and then I think of how the students themselves will be affected without a job this summer because of the misuse of this government program to favor their ideological allies. That's why I was happy to sponsor an electronic petition from a local resident, Joy Stankiewicz from New Hamburg, in my riding of Kitchener-Conestoga. Mr. Speaker, this petition is petition number E1484, and it reads as follows. Whereas the current eligibility requirements of employers seeking to apply for Government of Canada funding through the Canada Summer Jobs Program require organizations to sign an attestation stating that their organization's core mandate respects individual human rights in Canada, including the values underlying the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as other rights, including reproductive rights and the right to be free from discrimination on the basis of sex, religion, race, national or ethnic origin, color, mental or physical disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity or expressions. We believe that requiring organizations to attest that this is their organization's core mandate would force many organizations to choose between their beliefs, often rooted in their religion, and being able to receive funding. And by its nature, this requirement discriminates against the organization based on their beliefs. We, the undersigned residents of Canada, call on the Government of Canada to remove this discriminatory requirement and allow Canadians to continue to exercise their freedom of religion and freedom of expression without facing institutionalized discrimination by the Government of Canada. Mr. Speaker, this petition went live on February 6th, just a little over 3 weeks ago, and as of this morning had well over 6,100 signatures. Mr. Speaker, this government is out of touch with Canadians on their best day, but this is a new level of arrogance from the Liberal government 2 years into its first mandate. The minister's response to these groups across Canada was, don't worry, just sign the attestation anyway. Mr. Speaker, to be instructed to ignore your deeply held beliefs and to sign an attestation which is diametrically opposite to your fundamental worldview is to discourage dishonesty. It promotes hypocrisy. For each of us here, it's important that we aspire to the highest standards of integrity. In other words, we act on what we say we believe. Sir Thomas More is often quoted as saying, quote, when statesmen forsake their private conscience for sake of their public duties, they lead their country on a short route to chaos. End of quote. Mr. Speaker, that is so true. What the Liberals fundamentally fail to understand is that Canadians do have deeply held personal beliefs, beliefs they are unwilling to be forced to go against, and we as leaders should not be forcing them to forsake their private conscience. In 2018, it's an absolute shame that I am hearing from groups in my riding who feel bullied and pressured by their government to sign an attestation that goes directly against their beliefs. One group who has asked me to ask that they remain anonymous told my staff, quote, "We don't want our organization's name used because we are fearful that the Liberal government will cut our funding because we've spoken out." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, that is a shame. This group works with individuals with special needs. These are Canadians who deserve to be honored and celebrated by our government, not attacked. When the Prime Minister of Canada says Canada is back, I'm not so sure what he's talking about. Is he saying that Canada is back to discriminating against citizens who don't hold the same beliefs? Or that Canada is back to attacking Canadians' right to freedom of speech, belief, and expression? Another group in my riding, Mr. Speaker, that provides low-cost, full-day camps for kids in junior kindergarten to grade 5 had this to say in an email to my office, quote, "We find that many of the families who register for the camps are able to do so because of their affordability. We filled 240 camp spaces within a few weeks of opening registration in March, and parents in our community have come to rely on them. We love to be able to make these programs available to our community and have always felt so fortunate to receive the summer job grants from the federal government to make them possible." End of quote. The email then goes on to say, "We value loving and blessing our neighbours and don't ever want to discriminate against any group regardless of their beliefs. We believe in freedom of thought and religion. However, like many others, we will not in good conscience be able to sign the attestation as it is written into the new application. Our plan for application submission, as directed by our denomination and the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, is to move forward and submit our application without checking off the attestation box on the application." End of quote. Well, Mr. Speaker, by all accounts, by all indications given by this current government, this group, which provides subsidized childcare spots to over 200 children throughout the summer in and around my riding, will now be rejected simply because they refuse to go against their beliefs at the request, this unfair request of this government. What is the government's plan to help those parents who now can't afford accessible childcare over the summer? Mr. Speaker, I doubt very much that there even is a plan. A pastor in Canada, not far from here, Mr. Speaker, wrote to his Member of Parliament, the MP for Kitchener-Carleton. In his letter, he had this to say, quote, "We have a wonderful evangelical congregation here. It is active and vibrant, with a significant ongoing history of being very involved in the life of our community, with a positive reputation for a high level of community involvement and impact. From low-cost housing development behind our church building, including a 6-story building and multiple townhouse-styled units, and social projects like hospice care, from our monthly open table, which offers free meals to some 140 guests, to sponsoring a Muslim Syrian refugee family of 8, and from our international work in Mexico and last year in Rwanda, to local ministries like our on-site summer camp. We act on what we believe Jesus has asked us to do." The pastor goes on to say later in his letter, "Our belief is that the government does not have the right to ask us to make any kind of statement which conflicts with our religious conscience. I need to tell you that what I have heard from the government over the past month makes remarkably clear the government officials involved in this process simply do not know or understand us or our faith. It is sad that who we are and what we do is so radically unknown to our government. We could be a great asset in the work of justice and good things. That's what we do, and we do it well." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, Conservatives believe that Canadians know better than government what is good for them. We listened and consulted with community organizations across the country because we believe that Canadians have a right to hold their own beliefs and to express themselves without fear of judgment from the federal government. So, Mr. Speaker, in the spirit of the motion, I hope that all members will agree that organizations that engage in non-political, non-activist work, such as feeding the homeless, helping refugees, and giving kids an opportunity to go to camp, should be able to access Canada Summer Jobs funding, regardless of their private convictions and regardless of whether or not they choose to sign the application attestation. And Mr. Speaker, finally, it's my sincere hope that every member in this House will have the freedom to vote their conscience on this very crucial issue that affects all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
I listened to the list of services that the member is worried about not receiving Canada Summer Job Grants. Children's camps, Meals on Wheels programs, support for immigrants and refugees who arrive in his communities. Those core jobs, none of which involve violating people's human rights or basic charter rights, are all eligible under the attestation. Additionally, the organizations providing them, the core job of a church is not to challenge charter rights in a political fashion, but rather to support a moral framework under which one receives one's human rights. None of the attestation requires them to surrender their religious beliefs or violate their moral code. All it says is that the core organizational structure of the applicant cannot be a political one aimed at violating people's rights. For example, there was an organization in my riding that was receiving funding effectively to hand out postcards next to summer camps of little babies that were being tortured into some grotesque display, and it was hideous. And in fact, it's been now ruled as an illegal practice in the province of Ontario. That organization, whose only goal is to remove a woman's right to choice, is exactly what shouldn't be funded, in the same way that a political party shouldn't be funded through the Canada Summer Jobs program. If the member is really serious about protecting kids' summer jobs, what's the problem with signing the attestation? The core value of the organization and the job is not about violating charter rights, it's about providing a summer camp to kids. Why can't they be convinced to sign it?
The Honourable Member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for his comments, but the reality is that it is not primarily this side of the House, nor is it people in churches across this country who have been the loudest spokespeople on it. We've heard from nonprofit groups providing care for refugees, from nonprofit groups providing care for seniors or for mentally and physically handicapped people. Mr. Speaker, this is about individual freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and to be forced to sign a statement with which you fundamentally disagree. As I said in my comments, Mr. Speaker, many of my colleagues on this, just sign it and turn the other way and get the money. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, there are many of us who are not prepared to sell our soul for that kind of activity, and there's many in this country that are also not willing to sign an attestation that is diametrically opposite to their fundamental worldview. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague from Kitchener-Conestoga. It's interesting. What's happened here? They call this a value test of all things. If they ever wanted to have a value test, they should talk to the Prime Minister before he goes away on a family vacation to India. A value test that actually imposes a person's legal thought and value, and if it doesn't agree with the Prime Minister's, you got to check this box that says no, you don't get funding. Realizing the small businesses in my riding, the not-for-profits and the charitable organizations and their employees that work for them and the volunteers that work for them pay taxes. And what you're saying is now, well, because we don't believe and think like the Prime Minister, my taxes are not eligible for public funding because I don't believe what you as the Prime Minister. I asked my colleague, is that fair?
Before Kitchener-Conestoga.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I mean, there's no question about the unfairness. It's a totalitarian action taken to force groups to agree with the ideological position of this party. Mr. Speaker, in my riding over the last 12 years, I haven't counted them, but there's probably hundreds of groups, organizations, small businesses who benefited from this funding, and they would continue to benefit. Mr. Speaker, this year, many of them have signed the application without signing the attestation. According to what we hear, they will be rejected. But the bigger problem, Mr. Speaker, is that I hear so many who've looked at the application, and by the way, They were the ones that drew my attention to the fact that there was such a thing. I didn't sit here and someday go look through this and start creating, setting fires. It was they who came to me. But now, many of them, even after they've just read the total application along with the attestation, are saying, we're not even going to bother applying. And Mr. Speaker, that is the bigger shame. We're going to lose out on the projects and the activities of these communities and these community groups that are doing good work in our communities, and many summer students, probably thousands of summer students, will be without that work experience that would equip them to go on to another more permanent job. Mr. Speaker, it's a sad day.
Resuming debate.